Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Errol Louis.
Good morning. A pleasure to be here at the MAS Summit. We're going to talk a little bit for about a half an hour about density, diversity, and neighborhoods. And we have a great panel to help explore some of these issues. Starting from the end and going right down the line, Joe Cortright is president and principal economist with Impresa, a Portland consulting firm specializing in regional economic analysis, innovation, and industry clusters. Joe is also the founder of City Observatory. It's a new think tank on cities that's funded in part by the Knight Foundation. Sitting next to him is Tamara Greenfield, who is the executive director of Fourth Arts Block, FAB, and co-director of Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts, New York. Under her leadership, FAB has become a robust community-based network and has leveraged over $25 million in capital funds for cultural facilities. Japonica Brown-Saracino is Associate Professor of Sociology at Boston University, where she teaches courses on cities, community, qualitative methods, and Boston itself. She's the author of A Neighborhood That Never Changes, Gentrification, Social Preservation, and the Search for Authenticity. She's also the editor of The Gentrification Debates, which should be on your bookshelf if it is not already. And Sharon Zukin is Professor of Sociology at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She writes about gentrification, culture, and the creative economy. Her books include Naked City, The Death and Life of Authentic Urban Places, and the classic Loft Living, Culture and Capital in Urban Change. So thanks for being here, folks. Very good to see everybody. And I'm going to start with you, Joe. You've done some research on the scale and scope of gentrification nationally. It turns out that poverty is not being extinguished all over the place. Gentrification is not eliminating poverty nationwide. Tell us a little bit about how widespread gentrification isn't on some level.
Well, thanks very much, Errol, and I'd love to talk to you about some research we've been doing at City Observatory. And I just want to turn it around just a little bit and talk about our focus, which is on neighborhood change, and focusing really on neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And the reason we're interested in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty is that we know, as bad as the experience is of being poor, no matter where you are, if you live in a neighborhood where a large number of your neighbors and friends are also poor, that magnifies all of the negative effects of poverty. We know that crime is higher, we know that schools are worse, we know that public services aren't as good, we know that the community isn't as empowered as it could be. And we also know critically, thanks to the work of Raj Chetty and his colleagues at the Equality of Opportunity Project, that the prospects for intergenerational economic mobility, the chances that somebody born in a poor household will move up in the economic spectrum, are much worse if you live in an economically segregated neighborhood. So that's why we focus on neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And what we've done is look to see how neighborhoods, these high poverty neighborhoods in the United States, have changed over the last 4 decades. And we've looked at the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, basically all the metros with 1 million or more population. And we identified high poverty neighborhoods, neighborhoods where 30% or more of the population lived below the poverty line. And in 1970, there were about 1,100 neighborhoods, census tracts in the United States, that met that 30% threshold. And there were about 2 million poor people who lived in those neighborhoods, and about 2.5 million total population in those neighborhoods. Over the subsequent 4 decades, so between 1970 and 1990, 75% of those neighborhoods remained high poverty. So there was a very high persistence of poverty. And only 1 in 20 of those neighborhoods managed to move from above 30% poverty to below 15% poverty. So your chances that if you lived in a poor neighborhood in 1970, you went back to that neighborhood today, that it would have seen its poverty rate fall even to below the national average, were essentially 1 in 20. The other thing we know is that high poverty neighborhoods are not stable. They tend to lose population. So of the neighborhoods that didn't rebound, that didn't improve, they on average over that 4-decade period lost 40% of their population. So it's not the case that if neighborhoods don't somehow change that they stay the same. they continue to steadily deteriorate. And meanwhile, those rebounding neighborhoods, those 1 in 20 neighborhoods that did improve, actually gained population. They gained about a third more population than they had. One more thing I have to say. Concentrated poverty did not stand still. In fact, it expanded greatly. So today, there are nearly 3 times as many neighborhoods of concentrated poverty in the United States as there were, over 3,000 today compared to about 1,100 in 1970. And a lot of neighborhoods that were previously low poverty or below the national average of poverty, what we call fallen stars, have become high poverty neighborhoods. So when we look at the extent of poverty in the United States and concentrated poverty, which is what we're worried about, the problem is not from the standpoint of poor people in the United States, the problem of gentrification. It is overwhelmingly and far more commonly a problem of increasing concentrated poverty, and that's one that we really have to tackle.
Could I break in?
Yes.
I'd like to say that that is an extremely significant and worrying set of problems. But let me turn the conversation back to our city, where the other tale of the city is dominant at the moment. Yesterday, at a panel here that I attended, the audience voted that, when asked by the moderator, that housing was the most pressing problem in New York City today. Number 2, this is the 5th conversation that I have been in with media people or at public events about gentrification in the past 2 weeks. And third, in 2006, when my students at Brooklyn College walked into the first day of the urban sociology course, they had never heard the term gentrification. Today, they walk in saying that their neighborhood is being gentrified, and they live in East New York, which is one of the lowest income parts of the New York City. So we have a pandemic sense that people are being priced out of their homes. And the resolution that some of the most thoughtful people have come up with is to build more, to piggyback on growth. Now, easing the supply of housing may help, but we have to protect the right of people to stay in their homes if they want to do so, and the right of neighborhood stores to stay in their storefronts if they want to do so. And I don't see any laws coming down the road that will help people and help communities to preserve their right to be where they have been.
Well, I mean, one thing we find, though, Sharon, right, is that we know a lot more about the consequences of gentrification than we do about its causes or even its definition in a lot of ways. Everybody's got their own definition of it, right? I mean, some people think of it as sort of a racially driven kind of form of desegregation. Others go straight to displacement. Others look at, if they're economists, they'll look at sort of rising levels of either property values, rents, or income of the people who are living in the neighborhood. When you hear gentrification, whether it's from your students or anywhere else, or these last 5 panels you've been on, what's your working definition?
All of the above. But I stick to the original meaning of gentrification that builds into it an appreciation of historic old buildings. We know that the movement of higher income people into lower income neighborhoods has far outpaced that gentrification. And we know that new construction, like the construction on the waterfront in Brooklyn, has gone way beyond the rather limited effects of the first waves of gentrification. We know that there are many students, including some of my graduate students, who have moved into low-income neighborhoods because they're drawn to the city for their own advancement, but they can't afford a better place to live. So there are many forms of population movement and demographic change that are changing the fortunes and the complexions, if you will, of many traditional inner city neighborhoods. And we're calling all of these gentrification, but it's a bigger kind of upscaling in many different ways.
And yet, Tamara, you work with naturally occurring cultural districts, and the many artists that you work with, they're not gentrifiers. In many cases, they certainly don't think of themselves that way, but they may have that effect because of the sort of the side effects of their being there. But they themselves are not wealthy people, and even the nomenclature, naturally occurring cultural district, suggests that this is something that just kind of happened. It wasn't necessarily market-driven, right?
No, in fact, it wouldn't have occurred if the market were fully dependent upon, because the arts groups that I work with, first of all, on East 4th Street, it's been home to arts and cultural activity for over 100 years, starting with immigrant communities that self-organize their own forms of activism and culture, and it was very integrated. And over time, those spaces sort of got handed from one group to another group, and then they were in publicly owned buildings, and if they hadn't organized and convinced the city to sell them the properties for $1, they wouldn't have been able to stay in the buildings. And most of the arts groups that I work with are small dance companies and theater companies that come out of sort of different cultural self-empowerment movements of the 70s and 80s. So, you know, Spanish language theater companies and African-American dance companies and women in transgender theater collectives and groups that definitely in the marketplace of the East Village and Lower East Side today would not have an opportunity to stay. And there's a quote I like to say from years ago. I went to a gentrification conference, and there was a speaker there, and she said, people are like, well, what do you do? How do you stop it? And she's like, you've got to own the dirt. And unfortunately, a lot of neighborhoods, people don't own the dirt. But luckily, in the East Village and Lower East Side, I think because of decades of disinvestment in the neighborhood, arts groups were able to get into empty buildings. They were able to take them over. They were able to get them from the city, who was owning a lot of property. And so compared to like the West Village, we have an enormous range of art spaces that we're been able to hold on to. And those art spaces are deeply connected to the history of the neighborhood. They're not just newly sort of put in as a kind of form of economic development. They are part of the feeling of belonging in the community. And I think that's a really important piece.
I hear in Detroit they will now give you a house if you're going to be an artist. The ultimate naturally occurring cultural district.
Yeah.
Japonica, you've written about how, and you've talked with people that show that not all gentrifiers are created equal, right? I mean, if newcomers come to a neighborhood, some have sort of cultural practices and are sort of mindful of the fact that they've arrived and that has economic and cultural consequences. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so I studied 2 Chicago neighborhoods and 2 small New England towns. And in doing ethnographies in these places and talking with gentrifiers and watching them as they moved through space and went to community meetings, it became clear to me that our image of the gentrifier as a pioneer who moves in and is totally indifferent to everything around them and what the neighborhood was before is overly simplistic. To be sure, those people exist. But there also were other classes of gentrifiers. I talk about social homesteaders who are interested in preserving the built and natural environment, and social preservationists who are highly self-conscious gentrifiers who are aware of their role in the process and the fact that it leads to displacement and actively work to limit the displacement of certain long-time residents. It's very, very crucial, though, to recognize that they tend to select certain groups for preservation, thinking of these groups as sort of the rightful residents, that they have the most long-standing tradition in the place, or that for some other reason they have the greatest claim to that space. The social preservationists will engage in political, symbolic, and private practices to try to keep these people in place by working to promote affordable housing, supporting old-timers' businesses, working to mark space as belonging to old-timers. So through the creation, for instance, in Chicago, of a Swedish-themed streetscape or an Asian marketplace. But again, it's important to recognize that Swedes, for instance, in Andersonville were being commemorated while longtime Middle Eastern residents were not.
Interesting. Now, is there a possibility that that can be lifted up from sort of private practices to public policy?
I think absolutely. I think a lot of these individuals are actually engaged in lobbying for certain public policies. They're active in their communities, they're voting, they sometimes are working to elect longtime residents to city and town boards, but they are fighting a losing battle. I mean, I think this matters on the ground for interactions. It matters for, you know, a couple of businesses in a neighborhood, but the processes at work here are much larger than the gentrifiers themselves. And to a degree, they recognize this. One social preservationist said to me, "We're building monuments to a dying culture," even as he himself worked to commemorate the presence of Portuguese Americans, especially fishermen in Provincetown on Cape Cod. He knew that in doing so, A, it wouldn't necessarily prevent their displacement, and B, it might actually attract more gentrifiers to the space. So there's real recognition on the ground of how complex these issues are.
And there is a certain fatalism that goes throughout these discussions, right, Sharon?
Yes, absolutely. When you walk the streets of Bed-Stuy, for example, you find a lot of people almost resigned to the changes that are underfoot in the neighborhood, even if you don't see them yet on Fulton Street, for example. You see very positive changes: street furniture, new businesses, restaurants selling healthy salads, but people know that higher rents are coming. And I'd like to go back to what Tamara said about owning the dirt. There are two possibilities that are really difficult to get off the ground. One is to have some kind of subsidized ownership of property for individuals or collectives of businesses, and the other is subsidized rents, rent controls, longer leases, and these are the kinds of changes that speak to people, not just the buildings.
Yeah.
The notion, though, that you can sort of create a right to stay that's independent of anything else is not something I've seen tried, discussed, or even attempted anywhere around. But in our last 5 minutes, let's give some advice to this progressive city council and this progressive mayor. They've got their hands full with a lot of different projects, but clearly this is somewhere on their radar screen as something that they want to impact, not just through universal pre-kindergarten and affordable housing plans and so forth, but to get right to the heart of it. What would you suggest?
Well, I think we have to recognize that there is a huge and growing demand for urban living, that more people than ever value urban experiences, and that in effect now we have a shortage of great urban spaces. And so the big challenge for New York, and I think for other cities, is to figure out ways to increase the capacity, particularly to build more housing in cities. And I think one of the challenges, and it's a dilemma, is keeping the dynamism of place. And one of the great things about New York is it's a dynamic city. It invites immigrants. It's always changing. And continuing to have that dynamism and providing opportunities for a wide spectrum of people to live in the urban space. And the concern I have about preservationist measures is they can have the effect of causing the sort of the ossification of the process, that process of the urban dynamic that is so critical to making cities great. But we have to visualize our problem as the shortage of great urban spaces and how we build more opportunity for all kinds of people to live in great urban spaces.
And the key word there is great, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I teach students, and the ones who are from out of town, everybody's complaining about the rents. And I said, look, I can find you something. I can find you something today. It may not be where you want it to be. It's not going to be anywhere near the Upper East Side or anything like that. But the sort of the great part of it is really what this all hinges on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the cultural drivers of this, Tamara, are sort of a perception. It's almost like a stereotype, but that is really part of the dynamic, right? What should the city do? You want them to promote and help and support cultural development, right?
Yeah, but I think we need to be looking at the interconnectedness of all of these components. It can't just be the arts for art's sake, the artists are also being priced out. And I'm working closely, I work with Cooper Square Committee, and we share an office, and they're looking at longtime residents of the East Village and Lower East Side who are being driven out of the neighborhood, who are artists who've lived there for 20, 30 years. And I think the conventional narrative is that artists drive gentrification and they're the ones who are there and push everyone out, but it doesn't recognize how many artists were also part of affordable housing movements and were part of the revitalization of neighborhoods. And I think that what we need to be doing is looking at all the different ways that we can be building across different lines. So affordable housing and public spaces and those kinds of community spaces where lots of different people can cross their various communities, I think, are really important to the cohesion and the feeling of belonging in these new. If we're going to increase density, which it looks like we have to do, does it have to be generic and bland and corporate and luxury? Or can it be also dynamic and rich and allow for people to have participation in the process of developing it, and then also to shape it over time?
Well, can it be done right? There's a threshold question in some cases of whether it can be done at all, Sharon. I mean, the mayor has called for a respectful conversation about density. The notion being you're never going to get to affordable housing unless you sort of deal with that. I had on my show some videotape of one of those respectful conversations, and it had people calling each other names and an old lady waving a cane in the air, and it was not an auspicious beginning to this conversation.
But people are passionate.
Well, let me just say that you can have low-rise buildings with high density. We don't have to have 50-story skyscrapers that will warehouse the population. And when you put rich people in a 50-story building, somehow their behavior, since they can take their helicopter from place to place, their behavior is not always the same as when you put low-income people in a 50-story building. So let's consider that density does not always have to mean tall towers. Let's keep the human scale of the street.
Sure, but of course, you can charge maybe twice as much per square foot if people have got views of the park and across the river and everything else, right?
You don't have to. You don't have to. The profit rate was not handed down at Mount Sinai.
Well, I mean, but that gets to Japonica's work, right? I mean, how does one? I mean, it's an elusive kind of a concept. How do you create sort of a culture of sharing and respect and regard, and not disruptively changing neighborhoods, but changing them nevertheless?
I mean, I think the change is happening. The question is, to what degree and how are people able to hold on to some of the elements that were present in the neighborhood before gentrification takes off? And I think one thing to keep in mind is that affordable housing is crucial, it's key. But one thing we see in a lot of cities is increasing bifurcation, where we have poor and working class people who are able to stay in place and the wealthy who are able to stay in place. So thinking about affordable housing in broader terms is important. I also hear from many longtime residents that have been able to stay in place, sort of the lucky ones who stay in gentrifying neighborhoods, that it doesn't necessarily feel like home anymore, that they feel displaced even as they remain in place. And this is something we really have to tackle, and I think this goes back to stores and other businesses in neighborhoods. I read yesterday that the last lesbian bar in San Francisco is closing, and the owner said this has very much to do with the displacement of her base. But we have to think about what happens to the queer people who remain in San Francisco, what happens to populations who remain in place, maybe because of affordable housing, as all kinds of other things change around them. Michael Chernoff talks about social displacement in the context of gentrification. So this is thinking not just about physical displacement, but also about cultural and social displacement, losing political access, losing networks, losing access to goods and services.
Is this a big resort that we're going through geographically, as far as the inner cities becoming desirable and maybe the suburbs becoming less desirable?
I think there is a big sort going on, but I think, unfortunately, the focus on gentrification is myopic if we're really concerned about the plight of poor people. For every one person who lived in a neighborhood that gentrified by the definition we used, 20 more people ended up living in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty. And as as disruptive as the change that everybody's described in gentrifying neighborhoods is, the one thing worse than being in a gentrifying neighborhood is being in a neighborhood of continued concentrated poverty. We know it affects people's lives, their mental health, their economic prospects, and it adds to economic inequality in our country. And I think we would be better off if we thought a lot more about the problems of concentrated poverty and worried a lot less about the relatively rare instances. And I know I'm speaking to New York where it's more obvious, but it's still not as common as we would like to think it is.
And when you started out by talking about how this is going on in Raleigh and Charlotte and really all over the country. Are these kind of conversations going on as well?
I don't know. I think it does capture the imagination when it happens. It's very stark. It's a dramatic change. But what we miss is the slow deterioration of most neighborhoods and the growth of concentrated poverty, which is happening year in, year out in ways that are not as visible to the media and the public, but which have very pernicious consequences for our cities and for our nation.
Okay, that is going to be the last word. Please join me in thanking the panel, Joe, Tamara, Japonica, and Sharon. Thanks very much.